Brian De Palma once said that he considers himself to be more of a visual stylist than a storyteller, that the actual content of his movies is secondary to the visual images in them. But my favorite De Palma movies are the ones where he has married his trademark visual talents with good characters and good storytelling. I've seen all of De Palma's feature films, and in this video, I'm going to list my 10 favorites. Number 10, Mission to Mars. Mission to Mars is a personal movie for me because it was the first Brian De Palma movie that I ever saw. I was a grade school kid when it was released in 2000, and although I missed it in theaters, my grandparents taped it for me when it came out on pay-per-view shortly afterwards. It got bad reviews, and it flopped at the box office, but even as a child, I found it to be strangely mesmerizing, even if I didn't understand everything about it at the time. I like its old-fashioned story about a space rescue mission. I like Gary Sinise's performance, Ennio Morricone's epic musical score, that terrifying sequence where the Mars security system rips those astronauts' bodies apart. And there's one scene where a key character is forced to commit suicide that makes me cry every time I see it. De Palma has since admitted that it wasn't a fun movie to make, but I think the finished film is joyous, thrilling, melancholy, and in its depiction of space travel, inspirational. And for a kid who had never even heard of Brian De Palma when I first saw it, this was a fitting introduction to his career. Number 9, Phantom of the Paradise. Phantom of the Paradise came out in 1974, but I first saw it when it played as part of Fox Legacy on the Fox Movie Channel in the mid-2000s. Former Fox chairman Tom Rothman would introduce it on TV as the film where he first became aware of and fell in love with lead actress Jessica Harper, who he would marry over a decade after the film's release. Again, this film was a box office flop. However, this particular film has also become a huge cult classic since then. It's got a killer soundtrack by Paul Williams and colorful characters. Jessica Harper as an up-and-coming singer named Phoenix, Paul Williams as the villainous Swan, and the late William Finley as Winslow Leach, one of the most haunting protagonists in all of De Palma's work. You want to see him get revenge against Swan for destroying his life, and you want to see him live happily ever after with Phoenix, even when you know deep down that there's no way this story can possibly end happily. Many of De Palma's movies end with the guy failing to save the girl, but in this movie, the girl fails to save the guy. It's no ordinary musical, and as typical with De Palma, it's worth repeated viewings. Number 8, Blowout. Some people consider Blowout to be De Palma's best film. It's not quite that high on my list, but it is good. It contains what might be the best performance of John Travolta's career, and De Palma builds on intriguing themes about picture and sound which were previously explored by Michelangelo Antonioni and Francis Ford Coppola in other films. It actually took me about 5 viewings to really appreciate Blowout. It works best if you approach it as a conspiracy thriller in which every piece of evidence maddeningly disappears, and where the two young heroes are left to their own devices while everyone laughs at them and the villains plot to eliminate them as loose ends. The ending is truly tragic. The guy fails to save the girl. And that final shot of an anguished Travolta covering his ears at the sound of that scream, it's just devastating. Number 7, Carrie. When I was a young teenager, I discovered the original book by Stephen King hidden in my school library. I read it and I was totally disturbed by it. Maybe it's good that I read the book first because it prepared me for the movie, where I was able to appreciate De Palma's filmmaking without being turned off by the gruesome subject matter. I loved seeing Sissy Spacek and Piper Laurie doing battle with each other in those opening scenes at home. That's some of the most intense film acting I've ever seen. At the time that De Palma made it, one of his best friends was Steven Spielberg, and this film happens to feature both of their ex-wives, Nancy Allen and Amy Irving, respectively. It's fun to picture De Palma and Nancy Allen going on double dates with Spielberg and Amy Irving in the late 70s when they were all young and making movies together. And Carrie is more than just a nice adaptation of the Stephen King book. It's also a moving coming-of-age story, capturing all the pain, confusion, and mixed feelings which every young adult goes through. Number 6, Body Double. At this point, I've lost count of the number of times that I've seen Body Double. The movie plays as though De Palma took themes explored by Hitchcock and moved them into the 1980s, trying to figure out what would happen if you crossed Hitchcock with porn. Every time Craig Wasson looks through that telescope, you feel like you're taking part in his voyeurism, experiencing everything through his point of view. In my opinion, it's one of De Palma's most effortlessly watchable films. You can watch it over and over again and somehow never get bored. It's a great entertainment, with an involving central mystery which sucks you in completely. Number 5. Dressed to Kill. I see Dressed to Kill and Body Double as companion pieces for one another. They're both early 80s Hitchcockian-style thrillers, and it's difficult to imagine one without the other. Once again, De Palma is taking Hitchcockian themes and moving them into the 80s. Here he asks, what if a transvestite serial killer on the line of Norman Bates was murdering women as a way of punishing himself for his own heterosexuality? It sounds sick, but De Palma makes it engrossing by putting terrific actors in the lead roles. That early sequence with Angie Dickinson in the museum is about as good as suspense filmmaking gets. Nancy Allen fleeing from a killer on the subway? God, what tension. Keith Gordon as the young hero determined to solve the crime is basically a stand-in for De Palma himself when he was that age. And Michael Caine is just hilarious when Nancy Allen asks him if he wants to fuck her, and he's all like, oh yes. Of all De Palma's thrillers, this is probably my favorite. Number 4. Scarface. Scarface is perhaps De Palma's most famous film. While it wasn't exactly a big success in 1983, now it's one of those movies that's become a part of popular culture, and we're seeing it everywhere. To be fair, the film is definitely a collaborative effort, and what makes it work isn't just De Palma's gorgeous direction, but also the intelligent screenplay by Oliver Stone and that energetic lead performance by Al Pacino.
I was kidding! I was only kidding!
Of course, it's also a remake of the original Howard Hawks film, and this is another instance of De Palma taking themes of greed, power, the hint of incest, previously explored by a more classical Hollywood director, and then moving them into the second half of the 20th century, when movies were allowed to show things they couldn't back then. There's little to say about Scarface that hasn't already been said by countless others on the internet, but I mainly see it as a cautionary tale about a guy who gets everything he wants and then loses it all. We both like and dislike Tony Montana. We enjoy the rise and the fall. It's an operatic tragedy, and unlike De Palma's other tragedies, it isn't sad, it's exhilarating, from beginning to end. Number 3. The Untouchables. I've gone back and forth over my feelings about The Untouchables these past several years. The first time I saw it as a young teenager, I was convinced that it was De Palma's best film. Then I went through an older teenage phase where I took issue with the celebratory vigilante justice themes promoted by David Mamet's screenplay. But as an adult, I've learned to accept that the film's moral grayness is actually part of what makes it so interesting. Elliot Ness starts out as an ethical, decent cop, but by the end, he becomes almost just as corrupt as the gangsters he's fighting. The film is far from the best representation of what the police should be like in real life, but the point is that this is a movie, not reality, and as long as you don't take its portrait of the law too seriously, it does manage to work on a purely visceral level. I love Sean Connery as Malone. Every time he's on screen, he commands your attention, and he won a well-deserved Oscar for his performance. When he's killed by the Frank Nitti character, it's really heartbreaking, and that's why when Ness throws Nitti off the roof at the end of the movie, it is a pretty satisfying moment, as unethical as it may be. But De Palma elevates this material out of the ordinary with jaw-dropping sequences, most unforgettably that slow-motion shootout in the train station which evokes Sergei Eisenstein and Battleship Potemkin. And to be fair, the movie does kind of have a bittersweet ending, with Elliot Ness saying the line, "so much violence," which I think is a way of summing up some of the more unethical things he had to do in order to get to this point. This is definitely a De Palma movie with high replay value. I've lost count of how many times I've seen it, and I've come back around to recognizing it as amongst his best work. Number 2. Carlito's Way. After De Palma finished to work on Carlito's Way, he thought to himself, I can't make a better picture than this. I know what he means. For one thing, Carlito Brigante is one of the most likable characters in the history of movies, and Al Pacino plays him so well. I haven't read the book by Edwin Torres, but David Koepp adapts the material into what I'd classify as a very romantic film. Every time Carlito comes across Gail, the love of his life, you can practically see the sparkles in Pacino's eyes. This is a movie about a big old softy who just wants to retire, marry his dream woman, have kids, and live a happier life. But what finally makes the whole movie click together is De Palma's inspired decision to play Joe Cocker's "You Are So Beautiful" repeatedly on the soundtrack. Initially, the song wasn't actually meant to be in the movie and was merely used as a temp track for Patrick Doyle's musical score. But in an interview with Jeff Brand years later, De Palma explained, "I thought the temp track with Joe Cocker's song worked better than what Patrick had written. Composers hate when you do this, but I always have to make these tough decisions. You know, whether people are friends or not. I just look at it and think, this is the best music for this section of the movie." It absolutely worked in the case of this film, one of those films of De Palma's where the girl fails to save the guy. Every time it ends, I get so sad. Again, I want Carlito to get on that train with Gale and live happily ever after. But if the movie had ended that way, it wouldn't have been as powerful as it is. At least we're left with the consolation that Gale goes on to give birth to Carlito's child. To quote from Matt Zohr Seitz' review, "More than a dying man's wish, this feels like the director reassuring us that Carlito has been magically transformed, just as that billboard was transformed, and that his essence was passed on. Against all odds, De Palma gives us a happy ending. But not out of nowhere. The entire film is borne aloft by hope, a sense that nothing is fixed, that anything is possible in life. As Carlito details his past mistakes and delusions, the film is suffused with a warmth that comes from knowing that despite the pain of existence, it's better to be alive than dead. Cocker's song speaks simultaneously in two directions. It expresses the movie's love for its transformed hero and Carlito's love for life itself. Number 1. Casualties of War. As I said at the beginning of this video, I think De Palma's best films are the ones with good stories, and for me, the De Palma film with the most captivating story is Casualties of War. As Julie Salomon writes in her book The Devil's Candy, this story didn't allow for the satiric distance De Palma usually put between himself and his emotions on film. He saw Casualties of War as a chance to confront directly his recurring theme: the serious moral consequences of a failure to act, or of acting too late. There would be no hiding behind the conventions of suspense or action genre films this time. He would be openly admitting that he longed to make a big, important film that was visually splendid, but also had serious thematic concerns. Casualties of War was based on a true story, and De Palma had wanted to make it for decades. The late Don Steele deserves credit for greenlighting the project at Columbia Pictures. After a private screening of the film, Steven Spielberg turned to somebody in the audience and murmured, "You'll be thinking about this for a week." And that's exactly the kind of film that this is. It's horrifying, harrowing, and once you've seen it, you cannot forget it. I'm just sorry that the film was so unsuccessful at the box office. De Palma himself was so upset by the film's commercial underperformance that he wandered out of a French hotel and collapsed in the street. In retrospect, when I first watched the film as a young teenager, I knew I admired it, but I wasn't sure how I felt about the ending. Upon revisiting it as an adult, however, the ending made more sense to me once I heard De Palma's explanation for it. Michael J. Fox's Erikkson character is left living in fear of his squad buddies coming to get payback at him for reporting their rape and murder of a Vietnamese girl. But even for De Palma, this ending was too depressing, so De Palma made David Rabe write the more positive ending which we see today, in which Erikkson is shown to be having a nightmare about his experiences in Vietnam, then waking up from them and seeing a young woman on the train who looks just like the girl from Vietnam, an anecdote which actually comes from the original article by Daniel Lang, which was published in The New Yorker in 1969. And in the film, when the girl on the train reminds Erikkson that his dream is over, that's like her way of saying that Vietnam is over. It's like a bad dream, and it's time for America to wake up from it. This revelation shook me so much when I saw the film again that I suddenly became convinced that Casualties of War is De Palma's finest film, because it resonates so powerfully above all his other films. Decades later, De Palma would revisit similar subject matter in the film Redacted. And I like Redacted, but if I prefer Casualties of War, it's because it had a bigger budget and better actors, and De Palma tends to work best when given those things. As we've seen, Brian De Palma has directed several good movies, but while all of his movies are visually breathtaking, my favorites will always be the ones with good characters and good storytelling as well. Thanks for watching.